There were those hands again. 2 of them, hovering in a half-light made of moon and night, seemingly disconnected from the rest of the body by the very simple act of observation, like a person who might become disassociated from themselves by staring into a mirror for long enough. It felt like that at any moment they might move of their own accord, wiggle their fingers, clasp each other in support, or maybe just point the way. To him, they could be the hands that he longed to hold, or hands that might reach out to softly caress parts that only he had explored. Their shadow cast dark shapes onto the wall next to the bed, where a living mosaic was already playing out. A tree line of branches, twigs and leaves that shimmered and danced together. A silent film projected onto white emulsion for his own viewing pleasure, where a distant, unrecognisable part of himself was placed into the art. There, but not there. Of himself, but not himself. With no reference point to a greater body, those hands seemed timeless. Were they of a young boy, lost in a world of imagination, or an adult man, lost to the art of articulation? Maybe even an old man, lost to a past that was no longer as he remembered. He had laid in that bed many times over the years, staring up at those disembodied hands, with the tick of the clock and the occasional swell of wind or dog bark making it past the double glazed. And if the conditions were just right, he might be able to look into himself, to see those glowing beacons of fire that connected his consciousness in points of recollection, each one of which was constructed on a convergence of life-changing experiences, a junction of the insurmountable that pierced the surface and formed a peak to provide a lookout post where fires could be lit to light the path.
Not in vain the distance beacons. Forward, forward let us range. Let the great world spin forever down the groove of change. Tennyson, Locksley Hall.
A circle of fire, suspended in time, surrounded his earthly life, compassed points of possibility, where each action was rewarded with a reaction, creating a new trail to wander down. There was no wrong turn, just another opportunity, another viewpoint, an offer of change, which he could either take or leave. But somewhere, protected in the core of his being, he knew the truth, that the concerns of life would eventually burrow into reality and lay seeds of doubt which would grow tall and strong, turning things upside down and wrong side up. Scenes that he would never remember were gone, deleted from memory, re-edited with new lines and inserted as absolute, leaving a car crash of confusion and fear. But at least he had those beacons, didn't he? Those sentinels of truth raging against his darkness. Surely they could never be extinguished. He was drawn to those fires like a moth to a flame, always needing to get as close as he could to the centre, right inside, where the heat of those memories birthed a fever in him that could burn the weight off everything that he no longer needed, allowing his spirit to float up into the ether, higher and higher, where he could look down on creation. He was always returning to re-examine, again and again, to learn and return, again and again, to relive and repeat, again and again, just as he was, is, will be.
Danny Gildhurst Remembers by Nic Treadwell.
Slowly, Danny Gildhurst opened his eyes, and once again, everything became sickeningly familiar. the air musty, heavy with sweat, fear and anger, of piss and testosterone, shit and ammonia, riotous shouts punctuated by obscene taunts, half-arsed remarks, barks and tuneless singing. Walls knocked, gates crashed and footfall fell hard on metal landings and stairs. The commotion of a new day in an unfamiliar world turned his stomach. As he lay on the top bunk, he slowly surveyed the small room in disbelief. Against the far wall, a small desk, on which a transistor radio and a chessboard sat, its pieces poised mid-battle. On the wall above, a pencil drawing of what looked like an old tree, leaves suspended in mid-fall. Above, a small window crisscrossed with heavy metal bars that broke the morning sunlight into checkered patterns on the cold stone floor, while off to the side, it was hard not to be intimidated by the heavy-set metal door, complete with small square spy hole. In a moment that door would open, and a whole new chapter of Danny's life would begin. It was as if he were now the subject of an experiment where a rogue element was being isolated from a larger, innocent counterpart in order to observe and change its behaviour. Somewhere there would be a record in which detailed notes were written. Personal prejudice disguised as professional opinions. It had always been the same. Someone, somewhere was keeping count, tallying the score, balancing the books with rewards and penalties.
"We are a surrogate for a mind,"
they said,
"that was no longer able to safely navigate through life. Intervention is necessary in order to protect good from bad."
Wasn't it that simple? That they had to protect everyone else from him? He thought about who Danny Gildhurst really was. If he really was the sum of his parts, or a victim of circumstances that had conspired and gotten out of control, how on earth had he ended up in this place? As the sense of hopelessness overwhelmed him, he felt his heart begin to break. Thoughts of those that were now left on the outside, those who had trusted and loved him, and the safe place called home they had provided. Intense feelings of homesickness came over him, of all the things that he was now separated from. All that was left of those home comforts was spinning around in his head, threatening to render him an emotional wreck. He knew he could not afford to let those precious memories die, but equally he could not let them show a weakness in him to others. Hard as it seemed, he must also build a wall between his old life and this new one. But try as he might, being so close now to what once was, he could not stop the inevitable. His body needed to be cleansed, to wash away every trace of who he once was. He supposed it was a kind of healing, a chance to honour who he had been and to let that part of himself go. And so, he released himself and let the flood of tears rain down.
"It's Danny, miss. He's crying again,"
came a voice from the back of the class.
"Jason Parker, what have you been doing this time?"
answered Miss Corkins from the front in a stern, authoritative voice.
"Nothing, miss. He's just crying. I ain't done nothing."
Lisa Corkins sighed, got up from her desk and walked between the rows of children to where Danny was sitting. She bent down and quietly whispered,
"What's the matter, Danny? Has someone said something to upset you or—"
Danny sat with his elbows on the desk and his hands on his head, looking straight down at the surface of the wooden desktop. He didn't hear Miss Corkins' question. He was too busy tracing the swirling scratches and pen lines that littered the desktop. It was like one of those giant sprawling puzzles that he used to love doing when he was younger. The ones with either a pirate, fisherman or kitten at one end and a pot of treasure, whale or ball of string at the other. In an attempt to stop his fears, he was trying to distract himself by carefully concentrating on the path of each line. But the nest of doodles, which had been successively overlaid through the years, was a dense forest of marks and scars, a visible record of boredom, frustration and anger.
Come on, Danny. I can't help you if you don't tell me what's the matter, now can I?
In desperation, Danny began tracing faster. His mind didn't want to involve itself with such trivialities as talking with the teacher, which he knew would solve nothing. He was quietly residing in a place of familiarity, of safety, far away from the threatening alien planet he found himself in. And although he desperately tried to follow the tracks gouged into his desk, his eyes just kept getting derailed, allowing thoughts to quickly return home before jumping onto another line. He heard his mother's voice from that very morning.
Well, you've got to go, Danny. We can't have any more trouble with the school. Not after the last time you ran away. Remember, you promised Mr. Prosser, didn't you?
Danny recalled every plan that he'd hatched to try and get out of another day in that place, feigning sickness and insomnia, telling her how the teachers had it in for him, especially that Mr. Prosser, who had given a new meaning to the word strictness since he became head teacher.
School jumpers shouldn't be any other shade but cobalt blue. Lateness will be rewarded with a shortened lunch break, and spot searches conducted to ensure no illegal items are entering school premises.
His mother had heard it all before though, and even though she agreed with Danny that Prosser's changes were overly bureaucratic for a primary school, she had given up on trying to do anything about it, despite several confrontations with the man in recent months. She had simply heard it all before, and she was wise to all of Danny's tricks. Eventually, with the school bell closer to ringing, the realization of facing another day would choke him up. Distraught, he would be escorted to school, where he was duly abandoned. His mother was gone, and this other woman, this stranger, was here, drawing unnecessary attention to him. He wished she would go away, but try as he might, he couldn't calm himself enough to dry his tears. He was stuck in an uncontrollable cycle of despair.
Well, all right, Danny. I can see I'm not going to get an answer out of you. How about you try and get on with your work for me, huh? It might help you take your mind off things.
Lisa Corkins gave Danny a reassuring touch on the shoulder and then made her way back to her desk at the front.
Danny, you big baby, where's your dummy?
Danny looped the loop and climbed up a mountain made of squiggles.
Danny's gonna wet his panties, the big baby.
At the summit, there was a crude tree, branches in biro etched into wood grain, which he began to climb.
Danny's a spaz. Danny's a spaz.
Up and up he scrambled until he reached the end of the highest branch.
Just like his spazzy brother, Davy.
And then he jumped, and a sudden sharp alarm filled the room. Like the pained cry from a throat of an alien creature, its metallic legs dragged across the wooden floor as Danny lurched. No sooner had Miss Corking sat down than she rose to her feet to witness the animalistic dexterity displayed by Danny. In one flowing movement, he rose to his feet, turned his body backwards 180 and simultaneously raised his arm into striking position. His prey had little chance to react before being swiped across the face, the force of which knocked Jason violently sideways, causing him to burst into an eruption of cries and tears. Danny stood over Jason, his hands shaking, made into a fist, poised to strike again.
Danny Gildhurst!
Scolded Miss Corkins across the classroom.
Move away from Jason this instant!
Danny didn't hear. His mind was racing, a boiling pot under a flame of anger, fueled by the insult aimed at his brother. He stood firm, frozen in a trance of flight or fight. Lisa quickly helped a red-faced Jason up from his desk and out from under Danny's reach. He quickly exited the classroom as she instructed and went to go and fetch Mr. Prosser. The rest of the class, glued to their seats, waited for the next chapter of the story to unfold.
Now, Danny, I want you to calm down,
said Lisa in a quiet voice.
The headmaster will be on his way, and we don't want any more trouble now, do we?
A pained expression of panic flashed across Danny's face as he began to realise what had happened.
Miss, I didn't mean to. He called my brother that word.
He pointed to Jason's desk.
You know, you heard him, didn't you? You must have.
I'm afraid I didn't, Danny. I was too far away to hear.
But miss, I swear, he said my brother was a spaz. Crossed my heart and hoped to die. I swear to God.
Well, that's something that Mr. Prosser will have to determine later on, Danny. But anyway, that still doesn't excuse your behaviour. Now please, sit down calmly at your desk and we'll all just wait for the head to arrive.
Danny could see the chain of events stretching out in front of him like a train track that only had one destination. Now it all came down on him like a lead weight. How slimy Jason would deny uttering those words, then how the school would expel him, and how his parents would disbelieve his side of the story.
But miss, he called my brother names, and I was only trying to protect him.
Lisa didn't say anything. She stared back at Danny.
Please, just sit down, Danny, will you?
I'm sure someone else must have heard him say it. They must have, if I did. Maybe Dean Hughes or Nicola Reynolds.
Each sat either side of Jason's desk, and he nodded expectantly to them in turn.
Huh? You must have heard him say it, didn't you?
Dean and Nicola both looked toward Miss Corkins, who shook her head slowly.
Now, Jason, I told you, Mr. Prosser will get to the bottom of this. Now, please, sit down.
Danny brought his hands up to his temples, covering his eyes. He didn't want to sit. He couldn't because he didn't want to be there in that classroom, waiting for his fate to arrive like that. He wanted to run as far away from that school as he could, to be free of the padlocked gates, to run up Kingsway Road past the red postbox, to turn right onto Peachfield Avenue, through the traffic lights and up to the busy shopping area of Thornborough Road. There, he'd sprint past Fenrick's greengrocer and Miles' pet shop where he'd gotten his first hamster. And on he'd fly, with Harry's newsagent, the Starfish Chippy, Samuel's Jewellers and Your Price Clothes just a blur in his peripheral vision. He wouldn't be panting or puffing for breath, would he? Because he was as free as the blackbird which was permanently perched on the guttering above his bedroom window when he came home from school. But he couldn't afford to stop, so on he went, turning left at the supermarket, where he helped his parents do the weekly shop on a Friday night, across the zebra crossing and down Hooper's Hill, flying now, catch me if you can, on and on, his shoes clobbering the pavement, net curtains twitching as he bolted past. At the bottom, he'd have to apply the brakes hard, careering into Tanfield Close. Nearly there, don't stop now, don't look behind, his sprint now a gentle jog, as he passed the doctor's surgery where he'd thrown up 3 years earlier. Yes, and into the final push, gasping for breath, the air in his throat burning and his heart beating out of his chest. At last down the gully that led to Summerfield Park, where trees he loved to climb lined the walkway, and out past the pond, at the back of the dense patch of thicket he and his brother had spent many weekends, making the best den ever. That's where he'd be safe, where he'd wait until his brother would come and tell him what to do. But then he saw the hatch of the den open, and it wasn't Davy. It was Mr. Prosser entering the classroom, and the stone-cold expression he wore on his face made Danny's feet retreat into the corner like a hunted animal.
Now don't. You've got the wrong idea. You can't. I had no choice. I don't even want to be here. Don't you?
Mr. Prosser approached Danny slowly.
Now, Danny, listen to me. You will come with me this instant. The school will not tolerate this kind of behaviour.
Just get away from me. I want to go home.
Danny raised his fist to his face. His body stiffened.
Danny, don't make it difficult for yourself. Please, come with me now.
Please do as Mr. Prosser says. Come on now, be a good boy,
chimed in Lisa.
It wasn't my fault. He badmouthed my brother, sir. Called him a spaz. I was just protecting my brother. Jason shouldn't have called him that. Don't come any nearer.
His face reddening, Danny clenched his fists so tight they hurt, and the resulting pain felt good, as if he was on the right side of a wrong.
You've got no right, you lot. You think you can just tell me what to do. Let me go.
Danny, Your mother has been called and she's on her way. Now please, stay calm.
Mr. Prosser was now a couple of steps away. Danny tried to step backwards but realised he was already against the wall, that there was nowhere else to go. Try as he might to remain tall, the mere mention of his mother made something break inside him.
I told you not to come.
His voice cracked.
Closer. Now don't.
He wagged his finger toward Prosser.
Come any closer.
Face contorted as he tried to hold back a wave of emotion which crashed through to the surface.
Get away from me, you don't know who I am.
Everything was now a long drawn-out moan, almost unintelligible, as fear and panic smashed the facade of strength that anger had ignited.
I hate this school and I hate you.
Legs buckling, he faltered, slid slowly down the wall which was supporting him. His fists unravelled as his hands settled across his wet eyes. Eventually he settled on the floor, head bowed into his knees, arms wrapped around his legs, mumbling sorrowfully through streams of tears. And somewhere, in the stream of time, Danny heard his brother laughing at him, and he felt a weight pulling him down into a memory that felt uneven, that might tip his balance and send him reeling into a steep ravine. But while there was a dreamy quality to his recollections, there was also an ounce of certainty that he held on to, a brief flash of familiarity that anchored to his psyche. The angles were not quite how he remembered, like a crude childhood drawing had come to life, one that physics couldn't possibly support. The room was overly stretched in one direction, a forced perspective that threw everything else off, so that the floor sloped off downward quite impossibly. Against one of the long walls, a cabinet stood supported by small stubby legs. If there was anything else in that room, Danny's awareness had blocked it out, rubbed out its edges. It was daytime, afternoon. They were tired, the three of them, after a frenzied extended spell of play that Danny could only imagine. But they were happy at that moment, Danny and his brother, wide smiles on their faces, flushed with rosy complexions. If only time could have been frozen at that point. But time has a habit of running away, and Danny was always trying to catch up. Though when he did, something had changed, a sly glance between Davy and his mother that confused Danny, the kind Danny had seen in storybooks between two characters plotting some kind of mischief, and he wondered what Danny and her were cooking up. A fit of giggles ensued between the pair of them.
There's something I've got to tell you, Danny,
announced his mother, trying to stifle her sniggers.
Something important.
Danny tried to pull some of the fun from the other two smiles in an attempt to hold his own up at the edges, but it was beginning to flatten, as if sensing something.
You know I'm Davy's mother.
Danny nodded.
Well, I'm not yours, Danny. I never was.
It's true. You're adopted, lil bruv,
added Davy, trying not to laugh. Danny felt himself burning up. Beads of sweat formed on his face, just like the fever he'd had when he was kept off school with influenza. But that wasn't all. He could actually feel the room growing bigger, while he himself became smaller and smaller. He tried to make a word escape from his mouth, but he couldn't speak it, though he tried so hard over and over. It was always like this. He could never make it past that point to see what might happen next. Everything just became too unsteady. What had held it together before was melting away. Was it some kind of safety mechanism to save him from something even worse? In the last throes of life, growing ever fragile, the scene spun into itself and receded into the unintelligible language of electrical impulses firing between neurons and synapses. A predictive itch that would need to be scratched and picked at over and over again until it had made a monument in memory, a glorious tribute to remembrance, a place of silent meditation and prayer, where time was forever cropped and infinitely looped. It had been one of those glorious summer evenings, and one that Danny would never be able to forget. Whilst their parents were at the supermarket doing the weekly shop, both Danny and Davy had played out on their bikes, collecting friends on the way to Summerfield Park, where they were going to have a kickabout. Danny saw himself as more than just a brother to his older sibling. From an early age, he had become his protector, as Davy was born with cervical stenosis, meaning a narrowing of the space in the spine, resulting in a weakened neck and recurring pain which could be severe. To help shield him from injury and prevent unnecessary movement, he wore a hard shell neck brace which covered his neck and shoulders. Danny always joked that his brother looked like one of those American football players with huge shoulder padding. Of course, wearing the brace meant that he was inevitably subject to all manner of cruel name-calling from kids throughout the neighbourhood, and especially in the playground. But when he'd heard just about every variation containing the words turtleneck, retard, mong, spaz or freak for the millionth time, he had learned to unhear them, to control the frustration and anger that initially made his tears fall, blood boil and his head spin. He would often retort with witty comebacks using humour to diffuse the situation, but he never entertained striking back at the greasy-haired upstart that had uttered the insult, who had invariably just mimicked some other kid in order to get in with the so-called in crowd. Switching off became the easiest thing to do, though the same was far from true for his brother, who just didn't have the same patience. He was a fish who would be willing to bite and even get hooked by the lamest attempt at scorn. How many times had Davy sat Danny down and told him that the best response was none at all?
It's what hurts them the most,
he would tell Danny.
You see, it's all about them, not you. They're just trying to make up for their own lack of confidence by trying to destroy someone else's. If you ignore them, they won't get anything from you. They're like vampires, Danny, feeding off your energy.
But still, Danny couldn't stand by and watch his brother do nothing against a barrage of insults. Something in his gut told him he had to be the protector. It was his role, and no matter what, he would always step in to save him, even if Davy didn't want him to. Even in Summerfield Park, amongst a circle of trusted friends, Danny was still looking out for his brother, corralling him further away from where he and the lads were playing on the field. Davy wasn't allowed to play contact sports due to the fragility of his condition, but nonetheless, he enjoyed watching and became quite animated, cycling up and down the touchline, shouting encouragement and instructions to his friends. It was one of those 1,000,000-to-1 shots, a kind of fluke which most folks, when they heard events described later, with lack of any other explanation, resolved simply as being just one of those things. But somewhere the mathematics was precise, the velocity and trajectory of the incoming ball, the angle and speed of the deflected kick, and the fact that moments before Davy had seemingly wandered onto the pitch in order to retrieve another ball belonging to a small boy who had been playing nearby. All this then resulted in Davy finding himself in the direct path of a ball that crashed into the back of his head, knocking him to the ground. Danny would spend many a dark night mulling it over, and reach the difficult conclusion that it was not just one of those things. It was an alignment of stars, an arrangement of circumstances, an unknown force of energy that had taken his brother away from him. The force of the ball caused a concussion and head trauma, which in turn led to a lack of oxygen. Time, as a variable, was in short supply, and despite the emergency services being alerted quickly, there just wasn't enough of it for poor Davy, and far too much for Danny, who would have done anything to trade the many days, months and years he would spend frozen by the thought of those precious last seconds ticking away. And because there was no one to blame but a set of meaningless measurements, he would turn instead on himself. After all, it would have only taken one person, one other variable in an endless array of cogs and wheels to make a difference to the outcome, to change time itself and put a spanner in the grand scheme of the universe, which would have at least given a warning or even might have, just maybe, prevented the tragedy. So why could he not have been the extra variable? Why? Because that honour had already fallen to Jason Parker, who was also at the park with his own circle of friends, who had clocked Danny and started hurling the usual pile of insults at him, and for no other reason than gaining standing with his own social circle. It was one of those insults that had eventually provoked the desired response, causing Danny to make a break for Jason at speed, who in turn leapt onto his bike and flew out of the park. But those few moments of distraction? They were enough to split the path of the future and send him reeling.
Cat got your tongue? Danny Dan, Dan the man. What's up? You gonna say something? Hey, I'm talking to you. Come on. I'm only trying to be friendly. Keep you company on the way home from school.
Danny wished his legs had already carried him home and that he was already safely across the threshold, washing down a glass of lemonade while watching his favourite cartoon.
How about it then? Will you speak? Go on. You can do it.
But he wasn't. He was still at least 5 minutes away, and with this bee buzzing away in his ear, it would feel more like 10.
Everyone at school reckons you're a mental case. You do know that.
Eyes down, Danny kept one foot in front of the other.
Why don't you like school, huh?
It was one of those overcast autumnal days, a crunch of leaves underfoot, summer's warmth was turning, and winter's cold hands were poised to tip the balance.
It's not so bad. Some of the teachers are okay. You just got to give them a chance.
Buzzed the busy bee.
But you don't, do you?
It was none of its business, thought Danny, sticking its nose into places that it didn't belong. Why couldn't it just buzz off and leave him in peace?
It's no wonder you keep getting yourself into trouble, standing up against them and all that. You'll end up expelled, you will.
So what? Danny replied in his mind. His stride quickened in an attempt to reach home before he did something he might regret.
You know it's rude to ignore someone when they're speaking to you.
It wasn't rude if the other person had forced themselves on you while you were minding your own business. Danny normally enjoyed the walk home from school. He would let his mind unfurl in a series of daydreams. It was an expression of freedom from the restrictions of structure that had always made him feel a little claustrophobic. But as he got closer to his home that afternoon, his mind felt as though it were being mauled.
So, you got some kind of mental problem then? You know, maybe you should be going to that special school next to ours. You know the one, where all the kids stare at you like they want to kill you. Bloody freaks.
Danny had seen those kids too, and while their haunted faces made him feel uneasy, he also felt a strange kinship with them. It seemed to him that the place they found themselves trapped in was much the same space as he spent most of his time. Though his peers might have been quick to point fingers and poke fun, what Danny saw reflected in their eyes was himself, a tightly wound ball of fear and confusion, of butterflies that would never settle, and a magnetic force whose natural state seemed to only want to repel everything it was attracted to.
I'm just glad I'm on the outside and those psychos are locked away. That's all I can say.
Bet they're thinking the same thing,
mumbled Danny under his breath.
What you say?
Danny just kept walking.
Said something, didn't you? Don't think I didn't hear. I'm not deaf. I heard you. Think you're being clever, do you?
Danny wished he'd kept his mouth shut, but he'd felt that familiar tightness in his chest as the tempo of his heart went from a brisk stroll to full-on power walking. He just needed to get home. Not long now, he thought. A few more minutes and he'd be safe.
It's no wonder you ain't got no friends, Danny, with that gormless mug of yours. It's like you're from some other planet or something. Like you don't belong here. You know what I mean. You know what it is, don't you? You scare people. I've seen the fear in some of the kids' eyes. They're afraid of you. Think you're going to put a spell on them or something.
Danny counted his steps now, to take his mind off the relentless verbal assault.
But you don't scare me, mate, 'cause I know what you are. You've got no spine, just like that crazy brother of yours. He definitely belongs in one of them special schools, just like you.
Danny felt an atmospheric shift in his inner ear, as if an imaginary lever had been pulled, causing the timeline he had been on to shift onto an alternative track. It sounded similar to that of a reel-to-reel spool being changed over, creating an initial bump and disturbance before settling back into a regular rhythm. But something was audibly different. The air pressure had increased.
Must have been something in your family DNA, I reckon. Have your mum and dad got the spaz gene as well? Huh?
Danny turned into Spring Road. He was just meters from home now. He felt decidedly feverish and hot under the collar, so he loosened his school tie and wiped his forehead.
Slow down, man. You're getting yourself all hot and bothered. You know what I think, Danny?
Just need to get home.
Danny kept repeating in his head.
If I'd have had a brother like yours...
Come on, Danny.
Danny could see his house now.
I probably shouldn't say this.
Then don't, you moron.
I don't want to be cruel or anything.
Bit late for that.
But I think we both know, don't we?
Just fuck off, you bastard.
That your brother was never going to amount to much in life, was he?
Danny didn't like where this was going. His heart raced even faster, but he couldn't divert his mind from thoughts that were now going through his head. But he was nearly there, just a couple of houses away from putting a door between him and this pain in his ear.
And I think you know, Danny, that the ball hitting him like that, well, it was the kindest thing that could have happened.
Danny suddenly came to a halt outside his front gate. There was no stopping what was going to happen now. With his anger boiling over, he clenched his left fist so tightly that it started to hurt, and spinning in a blur, he released all of his rage into the stomach of his stalker, who had little chance to move out of the way. Winded and unable to breathe, the unwanted companion collapsed to the ground like a controlled demolition, settling onto his knees, with his body doubled over and unable to breathe. Danny simply turned, opened his gate, walked up the short path, opened the front door and walked inside, closing the door carefully behind him. Danny stood for what seemed like minutes inside the hallway, with his back to the door, wondering what had just happened. Outside, he could hear muffled cries and moans. Eventually, his curiosity got the better of him. He slumped down to his knees, tentatively prized open the letterbox and peeked out. There he was. Jason Parker. A sorry sight, slumped on the pavement. He hugged his stomach tightly while trying to hold back tears. Hearing the chink of the letterbox as it opened, his eyes turned toward the house.
You've done it now,
he shouted breathlessly.
I've not long come out of hospital a few months back.
Danny listened carefully.
Had my appendix out,
said Jason through gritted teeth.
Still got the scar if you want to have a look.
Danny pulled his head back from the letterbox and let out an audible sigh.
Here, if you don't believe me. Take a look.
The winded boy struggled to his feet and slowly walked up the path toward the front door. When he was a few feet away, he lifted up his shirt and turned slightly to afford Danny a better view. Danny looked hard, and sure enough, a faint red scar was visible on the side of Jason's bare stomach. But he said nothing, didn't acknowledge any guilt, remorse or regret, just slowly got to his feet and stepped back from the door. On the other side, Jason shuffled around nervously.
This ain't over, Danny. I'm not finished with you. You hear me?
He shouted, wincing in pain.
Every time you walk back from school, you better look over your shoulder.
Danny could hear a new level of vindictiveness in Jason's voice.
'Cause one day, I'm going to be waiting. Mark my words. freak.
There was a prolonged silence in which Danny held his breath, frozen to the spot. Then, at last, the sound of footsteps retreating slowly from the house. And when those shuffling steps had faded into the ambient murmurings of distant traffic, the neighbourhood din of excited children and the snappy outbursts of frustrated parents, Danny closed his eyes and took in a long, slow, deep breath. When he exhaled, the tension held in his bones released, and a soft, welcoming feeling of warmth spread across his cheeks on his face. Opening his eyes, he found himself in a beautiful meadow under a blazing summer sun that sat alone in a cloudless blue sky. Knee-high grass, interspersed with wildflowers, swayed in the breeze as he strolled leisurely down a narrow path, with not a soul in sight as far as his eyes could see. Danny remembered being brought to this place many times as a small boy. The many hours he'd spent here with his parents, engaged in the freedom of play, of picnics and the picking of flowers, of hiding in or being chased through long stalks of grass, of holding tightly to the end of a length of string which magically reached its way into the sky, a diamond of red at its end with a huge tail flapping endlessly in the wind. This was Danny's happy place, somewhere that was all his own. He had come here whenever he needed to escape the world, when it wouldn't leave him alone, when he wanted to silence the niggling doubts in his head, or just to have some space around him when he needed to think things through. Once his eyes had adjusted to the light, Danny realised that the intensity of the colours surrounding him was somehow heightened. It was a subtle effect, but as if an artificial filter had been placed over the lens of his eyes, making everything seem that little bit richer and deeper in colour. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something told him that what he was experiencing wasn't completely natural. As he continued to follow the path, tracing its progress through the meadow into the distance, Danny felt the briefest tug of emotion in his heart, as if a single drop of icy rain had fallen into his otherwise sunny disposition. A sharp, where everything else was flat, that caused him to place his left hand on his chest, to close his eyes, and take a sharp intake of breath. And when he reopened his eyes, he could see before him, standing proudly alone in the middle of the meadow, a single sycamore tree. Its fragile leaves shimmered in the golden light of the afternoon sun, as though it were trying to commune with its surroundings. Danny couldn't ignore its call and began along the path that led to the living statue. Light of step, renewed with purpose and without any recall of the moments leading up to this one, Danny made his way along synaptic paths with magnetic attraction, and with every step the light from above seemed to dim by a tiny but noticeable degree, denying a smooth transition, as if an antiquated micro had been placed in charge of turning the wheel between light and darkness. Like a clockwork time-lapse running out of steam, the closer Danny got to the trunk of the tree, the slower his steps became. Try as he might to hurry himself, it seemed his body was under the control of some outside force that didn't want him to reach the tree. The afternoon light had now played into a deep blue vastness that brought with it a chill of cold, but even though the sun had fallen beyond the edge of the horizon, Danny felt a warm glow from the blazing leaves above him, as if something familiar were reaching out toward him. In response, he had the impulse to make contact with the old tree, placing the palm of his hand flat against the rough bark. Suddenly, an instantaneous bolt of recognition made itself known to Danny. It was immediately apparent that somehow he had managed to remain blind to the edifice that rose up before him. But now, as if some invisible barrier had been removed, he knew it to be an old friend, the sycamore tree from Summerfield Park that he and his friends had played in as kids. It was as though an invisible cog from some other sphere of time had turned, and aligned itself with Danny's. A hidden gear that had shifted itself and raised up from the depths a form and brought it into sharp focus in front of his eyes. Before Danny was an image of himself that he recognised all too well. A scared, disgruntled, confused version that was still suffering with the complexities of grief. Danny felt a pang of sorrow for his other self, who nervously looked into the distance at something before beginning the ascent of the tree, climbing up into the branches with ease, just as he had done 100 times before. Almost instinctively, and without a question, Danny knew that he must follow, and, with some trepidation, started to climb up through the bulky main line of branches. After the passing of some minutes, he was sure that he should be as high as he could possibly get, but no, on and on he went. It seemed as though it was not a tree he was climbing, but a beanstalk, almost losing himself in the tangle of stems and twigs that weaved their way around him. He had long lost sight of his shadowy counterpart. Surely it was never this hard when he shot up this tree as a youngster. When he could go no further for fear of being lost or losing his footing, he came to a stop at what seemed a safe conjunction of thick branches that formed a kind of platform. He looked ahead through the tussle of leaves and could just make out a few twinkling stars in the now black sky. Although it had been an arduous ascent, he now felt safe and protected as he tucked himself into the arms of the old tree.
"Oi, Danny, you up there?"
came a shout from below. The voice echoed up through the branches to Danny's position. He wasn't surprised that it was Jason Parker down there, standing at the base of the tree, looking up into the illuminated canopy. He'd always known it would be, but he couldn't explain why it was only now that the mechanism to open his knowledge was available. He immediately looked down through the melee of leaf and branch to see if he could see Jason below, but there was no clear view.
Yeah, I've been waiting for you, Jason. Why don't you come up? Or are you scared of heights?
The voice was Danny's, but he didn't utter those words there and then. As silly as it seemed to him, they appeared to have radiated out of the thousands of leaves surrounding him, as if the tree had held on to a memory and was now replaying it back. A reply from below echoed up into the canopy.
"Not scared, mate. I'm coming up, and you better be ready."
Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere,
came a reply in Danny's voice. Soon enough, Danny could hear the rustling of branches from below and knew it was Jason scrambling up to meet him. Try as he might to search his memory for this event, somewhere, anywhere in his past, he could not find it, and this perturbed him. If this was an echo of a memory, then why could he not place it? The most likely explanation, that he had simply forgotten it, seemed absurd to him. It took Jason substantially longer than Danny to climb, and when he emerged through the confusion of leaves and branches, he was tired and out of breath. His face was as white as a sheet, which told Danny that he was also afraid. Jason stood on a slightly lower branch and regathered his composure before addressing Danny.
"So, here's the little squirrel hiding up the tree then. What have you got to say for yourself then?"
Danny stood there and waited, but there was no reply from the swell of leaves around him. He had no idea what to do.
"Don't say you got me all the way up here so you could give me the silent treatment again, because if you have, I'm going to get very angry really fast."
There was nothing from the tree. No voice, no counterpart, no inkling of what Danny should do. Just the shimmering whisper of leaves around him. It seemed as though Danny would have to handle this on his own.
Well, this has to stop. Right now.
Danny could hear himself saying the words, but he didn't quite know where they came from.
It's gone on long enough. And I don't know why you hate me so much, but in that hating, you have made me so angry and full of rage that I would like to...
It's because you're weak, Danny. Because you're unlike anyone else I know. And it's easy to wind you up. So why should I stop?
It's over, Jason. Can't you see? We've grown up, you and I. We're not school children in the playground anymore.
Makes no difference to me. This is who I am.
Having control over others is a powerful thing, Danny. Look around you at the world. It's everywhere like a disease. Everybody has control over someone else. If not parents over children, then bosses over employees, politicians over the electorate, and filthy rich corporate scumbags over everyone else. Not to mention the police, the army, and beyond that, raging mad dictators off in other countries. It's part of life. Natural selection. Survival of the fittest.
Crap and bollocks. Your mind has twisted everything just as it normally does. You don't get to compare yourself to everyone else. You're responsible for your actions, and you alone. You don't have any control over me. You're just an irritation, and that's all. Like a poisonous spot on my back. And it ends now.
And what are you going to do about it, Dan the man? What have you got for me? Huh?
Danny could feel his heartbeat rising and the familiar beads of sweat across his reddening face.
I should have ended this years ago. Should have given you a damn good hiding. And I could have, but...
But what?
Replied Jason snidely.
I'll tell you what. You listened to the advice of that half-wit brother of yours, didn't you? He was weak, just like you, and look what happened to him, huh?
Danny felt a tremble in his bones, resulting in him almost losing his footing. He quickly recovered himself and felt something rising up from his stomach, a vomit of verbal abuse.
You're a fucking piece of nasty work, Jason Parker. How dare you rubbish the name of my dead brother? You're sick. You have no right to speak ill of the dead. You've no right to fucking speak, and I'm gonna shut your mouth forever, you son of a bitch.
Danny lunged forward and jumped down onto the branch that Jason occupied. He quickly grabbed Jason by the throat, feeling a mixture of pent-up anger and hatred, and began to throttle him. Jason struggled for air as his throat was restricted. The both of them were locked in a tussle. Danny, completely under the spell of his revenge, could see nothing but the ending of Jason, while Jason fought and struggled to pull Danny's hands away from his throat and free himself. It seemed to Danny that at last he was going to free himself of this thorn in his side, and he would have succeeded, if not for a seemingly magical intervention. The leaves of the great tree dimmed and brightened, and Danny heard the familiar voice of his brother echoing around the branches.
Danny, don't give in to him. Listen to me. Remember, it's not about you. If you gift him what he wishes, you will only become a reflection of what he is. He's an energy vampire. Starve him of what he wants, and he'll wither away. Don't let him feed off you. Danny, please.
Davy's words filled Danny's ears, and somewhere, down in the deepest part of himself, down where the truest of truths lie, he knew that Davy's words were true. With horror and regret at his actions, Danny quickly removed his hands from Jason, who, choking for air, stepped back in fear, his hands caressing his sore neck. Danny couldn't believe his actions.
I'm sorry, Jason. I shouldn't have. I didn't mean to. I just got lost somewhere.
You'll pay for that, Gildhurst. You just wait,
replied Jason in a raspy voice.
No, Jason. It has to stop before something terrible happens.
Danny looked Jason straight in the eye and tried to appeal to his better nature, if in fact he had one.
Please, Jason, listen. I don't hate you now. I realise that me being a willing participant in this thing between us just kept it alive, but no more. Whatever went on between us before doesn't mean anything. It's this moment that matters, right now, and the choices that we make.
Pseudo-psychological crap trap. Jesus, you'll have me sitting in a room with a set of crayons and a mindfulness colouring book next. Really? Is that all you've got, Danny? Why don't you just go the whole hog and tell me it's all my fault, that I'm just a victim of a sick society, eh?
Because that would be your way of just washing away any blame or responsibility for your actions. The change starts with you, Jason.
Bloody hell, if I listened to you, I'd be starting every day by getting up at the crack of dawn to witness the majesty of the sunrise while chanting a handful of meaningful as gratitude mantras over and over. Well, Here's a mantra for you. I am grateful for my life and my ability to be able to repeatedly fuck with the retard Danny Gildhurst over and over again. It gives my life purpose.
Jason broke out into fits of uncontrollable giggles.
And how about this one, eh?
He continued, trying to regain his composure.
I am grateful for Danny Gildhurst, the sad loser with no friends, whose emotional outbursts have provided me with hours of entertainment over the years.
Danny remained calm and resolute.
And here's a real beauty. You'll love this one, Dan.
Mocked Jason, who was now shaking with nervous laughter.
I, Jason Barker, am eternally grateful for Danny Gildhurst's dearly departed brother, Davy, for his continued contribution, despite being deceased, to my positive mental attitude. For when I think of his short, sad, miserable existence, it truly makes me grateful to be alive.
Jason was so happy with himself that the permanent grin on his face transformed into something hideously grotesque. Even Danny, who just stared at him, felt little compulsion to wipe it off. Jason's body shook with tremor after tremor of laughter, each one more powerful than the next, and he couldn't make it stop. At some point, fighting for breath, he would try to intake a gulp of air and almost choke on his own fits of giggles that he couldn't keep down. The more Jason looked into Danny's steadfast expression of pity, the louder and more explosive his convulsions and hysterics became, and so that is, he was unable to remain still enough to keep his balance on the branch beneath him. Danny saw Jason falter with a look of terror on his face. His grip on reality had turned upside down now, and he no longer knew which way things around should be. There was one moment, though, when it looked like he may be able to regain his self, where Danny saw in his eyes a brief flash of recognition and knowing. At this, Danny thrust himself forward in the hope that he might catch him, but then Jason's expression changed and another contraction of giggles burst from his belly, throwing him backwards, down through the twisted branches and golden leaves. Danny couldn't distinguish whether Jason was laughing or screaming as he fell. He just vanished into the darkness below and was gone. And with his fall from grace, every golden leaf on the old sycamore released itself in turn from its parent and danced down through the air majestically into the waiting darkness below. Danny remained perched on his branch and stared into the night. Confounded by the events that had just played out, he searched and searched through his memory for clues, and there, where there had been only blackness before, was a wave of memory that crashed into every part of his future life with devastating consequences. This memory had no rhyme nor reason. It was just brought into being by a decision in a split second, just as any other insignificant choice has to be made. But the consequences were life-changing, not only for himself but for everyone else connected. He remembered now that following this memory, Jason had disappeared suddenly from his life, and how this had confused him. For shouldn't he have been relieved that the monster was gone, unless there was more to tell? And it was that telling and remembrance that had broken him, to the very point that his mind had had to take precautions to remove every trace of that memory. Until this eternal now, in this place of safety, this time out of time, where a wider context can be looked down upon and viewed with the greatest clarity of all, love. And so, Danny was able to let go of what he no longer needed. And he too fell from the tangle of memories that were held by the great branches of synapses in his mind, to a place of rest and peace, to a bed that was once familiar, in a room that lay in the half-light between moon and night, where projections of life beyond danced on a wall next to him, shadows of tree and leaf that he could be lulled by and lose himself in, and all that would remain of himself were those hands, reaching out into the shadows.
Danny Gildhurst Remembers was written and narrated by Nic Treadwell. Additional voices sourced from 11 Labs. Sound effects sourced from freesound.org. Music sourced from freemusicarchive.org, including Blue Drone Lemon by Blue Dot Sessions, licensed under Attribution Non-Commercial. Run by Philip Weigel, licensed under Attribution International. A Mystical Incantation by Peter Rudenko, licensed under Attribution International. And Post Drone by Uuriter, licensed under Attribution.